Welcome back to Analysis. In the first part of the programme, we were discussing the implications of a recent speech made by Tony Blair, in which he declared that growing Islamic extremism is the biggest threat to world peace. In the same week, Scotland Yard released a new campaign asking Muslim women to monitor the activities of their family members to see if they were to show any interest in doing something about Syria. This initiative aimed at dissuading young British Muslims from travelling to Syria, but the scheme has been slammed by community leaders as ineffective and likely to criminalise a whole community. Scotland Yard has rejected these allegations.
I think the police are a very good entity. We're more coordinating than leading in this area. The police have a long tradition of working to protect people. It's part of our core role and very important. So I do think that we are right to be coordinating this effort.
So is this initiative an example of effective counter-terrorism or an attack on Muslims? In the studio with me are my guests from the first half, Azam Tamimi, Director of the Institute of Islamic Political Thought based in London, Chris Nynham, National Officer of the Stop the War Coalition, and Chris Doyle, Director of the Council for Arab-British Understanding. On the phone, we're joined by Jahan Mahmood, a former government advisor on counter-terrorism. Welcome back, everybody. So what do you make of this initiative? Because, you know, Blair's speech framed one end of the week. There's the ongoing, as Chris was mentioning, you were saying, the ongoing investigation into accusations of terrorism against the Muslim Brotherhood. Blair managed to get into his speech the investigation of Birmingham schools. Is this all beginning to look suspiciously like a pattern?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't blame the police for whatever they're saying. They're implementing policy. It's the policy makers who are responsible for this insanity. Because if we go back to the time when the uprising in Syria started, officials in the UK government were very sympathetic to the revolution. We heard statements that bordered on intervention at one stage. Muslim men and women in this country, as well as many others, felt on the basis of humanity that they had the responsibility to do something about what was going on in Syria. And now the government retracted and is incriminating or intends to incriminate people whom it initially encouraged to express sympathy and support for those who are badly affected by what's going on in Syria. So it's policymakers who seem to be messing up and not the police.
Is that how you read it? I mean, we did have 2 years of we must arm the rebels in Syria, we must intervene on behalf of the rebels in Syria. Then last August that all went pear-shaped when they couldn't get the vote in the Commons, and now it's like, oh, they've been taking us seriously.
I agree. I think that it points to really a failure on Syria. Uncertainty as to what to do. They got carried away in that first 6 to 12 months in terms of Assad must go, his days are numbered, and as the regime survived and was able to counter and militarize the uprising in Syria, I think that Syria policy has been in chaos. And I think when I hear that they're trying to get British Muslims' mothers to inform, my immediate thought, this is a policy of desperation. This is not one of strength. This is almost like the last resort. You know, what other tools do we have in our box to try to deal with this issue now that we don't want people to go over and fight in Syria? And there are a lot of people, as Azam Tamimi has quite rightly said, who've gone to Syria. They've gone there because they believe they're fighting a ruthless and brutal regime. And there is a danger that when they come back, that they will be treated as criminals. And I think that we have to be very, very careful. Some of them might come back, you know, radicalized and extreme, but the research shows that I think about 1 in 7 maybe, or it could be at risk of that. Many of them, will be shocked and surprised that they will be treated in such a fashion. So I think it does point to a real chaos on the Syria front. We weren't sure what to do. We have toyed with all sorts of ideas of a political solution, arming the opposition or direct military intervention at one point in time or another, and haven't really committed to any one of those three, and have lain in some sort of halfway house in between all of them. And unfortunately, we're now in a situation on Syria that it doesn't look like it's going to be ending anytime soon. There are no good choices left on Syria. It's an utter disaster. It's going to destabilize the wider region. The neighboring countries already has done that. And of course, there are going to be even more foreign fighters going in, including from Europe.
I mean, Chris, what about the wider pattern here? Because I mean, you know, as I was suggesting that that this won't be received well. I mean, it sounds a bit like a kind of even more kind of advanced form of the old prevent strategy, which collapsed in such ignominy under the Labour government. Really, I mean, I know it staggers on, but I mean, it was basically taken by large segments of the community to be as an invitation to inform for money. This looks like a bit of the same, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. In fact, I think it is being done under the umbrella of prevent. So there is continuity there. And you have to think, what's this going to look like from the point of view of, young Muslims and the Muslim community in general? And it seems to me it's going to look like even more of Big Brother, really. You're asking our mums and our wives to spy on us, really, and what to inform to the police. I mean, I don't think this is something that's going to encourage a sense of belonging and engagement with British society, really. And plus, as you say, the ironies when it comes to foreign policy are dizzying, really. I mean, one day Tony Blair comes on TV and says, we've got to support the opposition in Syria. The next day the police come out and say anyone who gets involved is going to be banged up, essentially. And plus, everyone in the British establishment is supporting Saudi, Qatar, the other countries that are sponsoring the very organisations that our young people are not allowed to get involved in. So, I mean, it is just a complete and utter mess, to be honest.
Johan, do you think this is what's happening, really? That the kind of the wheels are coming off foreign policy, but the domestic blowback is extreme now?
No, I definitely agree with all the comments made by your guests. I mean, having advised the government for 2.5 years, I had to leave in the end because I just felt they couldn't uphold their own ideals. I mean, you're expecting the community by and large to hold to, and you're holding them accountable to your ideals, but for some reason you can't uphold them yourselves. So how does that work, for instance, on a street level? Well, what you're saying is that Muslim women need to prevent their loved ones from going out to help the people we're helping, but it makes them terrorists but not us. I mean, how do you possibly win traction on that argument? This is a battle of ideals, and the government likes to believe that its ideals on a higher platform. And then I've heard young men say, well, the same government that is asking prevent workers to challenge us about Al-Qaeda ideology has supported their associates as proxies to bring down Middle Eastern leaders, or in the case of Gaddafi, for instance. And then the same government will say, well, Wahhabi ideals are not in sync with British ideals, but we sell billions of pounds of military hardware to the largest proliferators of, let's say, Wahhabi interpretation, the Saudis. I mean, how are you ever going to win the argument if we keep shooting ourselves in the foot?
Well, Scotland Yard obviously don't see it that way. They say they've been working in collaboration with the Muslim charity Jan Trust, and the Charity Commission has stressed that the campaign is not targeting Muslim women, but seeking to support them.
Well, we're wanting to talk with women. Women are very influential in families. They're often the people who spot the signs and symptoms of someone who's thinking of travelling to Syria. Sometimes they're the ones who have to pick up the pieces and who are really affected by the tragedy. And we also think that bringing women together gives women a great deal of confidence because they realise that there are a large number of women who feel the same way that they do.
Dr. Tamimi, I mean, I think anybody who knows anything about the Muslim community knows that charitable work is a huge part of it, and that there's been a very large amount of this work directed at Syria, for the reasons that we can all understand, because of the huge loss of life, the refugee question. Do you think that one of the things that will happen here is that genuine charitable work will be damaged?
Well, indeed, we already have reports from people working in charities that the authorities don't seem to make a distinction between people who go to fight and people who go to serve the needy. The catastrophe in Syria has even surpassed the Palestinian catastrophe. Now we're talking about 10 million people displaced and refugees. Many of them are in dire need of basic necessities. And listening to this policewoman, wouldn't you think it's a more worthwhile project to talk to women and mothers and wives here to probably dissuade their husbands and children from crime, from drug trafficking, from such illicit acts that plague our society, rather than pick on the Muslim community and try and create divisions within that community. And that will not happen. It will fail. It will not succeed.
I mean, Chris, one of the things that's happened recently is that William Shawcross, who is himself a very powerful neoconservative figure, is now head of the Charities Commission and has launched his own investigation into supposedly Islamist.
He's launched his war.
Yeah, I mean, this is when we begin to add this up. When you've got the security services, the Blair speech, the investigation of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Birmingham schools thing, the Charities Commission. I mean, I personally struggle to think of a moment, at least since the very beginnings of the war on terror, where there's been such a concerted series of initiatives from different elements of the political establishment over this issue.
Well, that's true, and it would be very sad if the British Muslim community started to feel under attack or became under attack in any way. I think it's part accident and part the political climate. I think one has to look at things like the rise of UKIP and the whole immigration debate as one aspect of this. So all the parties are desperately trying to show they're anti-immigration, and so you get this, Islamophobic rhetoric that has come out of that issue. I think that you then have the whole issue of Syria and so forth, and it sort of wants to divert attention away from the government's failing on that. So let's pass the buck to the Muslim community. They become easy to blame in that sort of sense. You can pass blame on to them. But it doesn't help in building community relations and making them part of the solution. It's still a very cack-handed and dangerous approach. So yes, William Shawcross, Charity Commission. I would say one thing, though, about this inquiry into the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, I think it's a lot of people suspect it is because of Saudi and Emirati influence that it's taking place. But I think it's also really very clear that the government is not going to prescribe it as a terrorist organization. It's not purely about whether it's terrorist or not. It's far broader than that. I think actually it was another example of a very crazy way to go about an inquiry. It's authorized by the Prime Minister. It's carried out by the British ambassador to Saudi Arabia. I mean, it looks as if it is to appease the Saudis. You're going to carry out in sort of semi-public, where you only publish the conclusions and not the factual evidence on which those conclusions are to be based. If it is about the Muslim Brotherhood being terrorists and they should be prescribed, then it should go through the appropriate policing security channels. Have they done something illegal, criminal, etc.? Are they a threat? Then they're prescribed, as happened with other organisations. That's not happening. It's a whole song and a dance, really, which I suspect will probably blow back in the government's faces, where nobody will be happy with the outcome whatsoever, just as nobody will be happy with these Charity Commission investigations, or indeed this initiative on mums and Muslims in Syria. I mean, it's still not a joined-up strategy.
I mean, Jahan, you'd expect policy like this or inquiries like these to stem out of a series of criminal prosecutions, wouldn't you? You'd expect them to be saying, well, look, there was this case and this person was jailed for that, and then there was another one, and then there was another one. It looks like we've got a general problem. Let's have an inquiry, or let's frame new legislation. But this is a kind of preemptive strike at policy level, isn't it?
No, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, I've asked the local police for figures around returnee jihadis over the years, and how many of them have actually been convicted under the Terrorist Legislation Act. I mean, I'll be honest, I can't think of one that I could find. They haven't got back to me because they're part of this whole convoy now of the Syria Awareness Roadshow. So if they're coming out with figures like I've asked them, it naturally damages their endeavour. But I totally agree with you. I mean, I don't know what else to say. On the ground, the situation is very different. The police claim to have connections and a good network, but counter-extremism is completely failing. And I also agree with what some of your commentators have said, is that you need to reach out to the community and build bridges. And all we're doing is isolating them. The conversation is going further underground because of newsreels and the media sensationalizing. I mean, it's become hysterical, and it's a frenzy, really. And therefore, the conversations go further and further underground. And in the end, we're not going to be able to talk to people and create a space where we can guide and channel some of that energy. Instead, we're just going to completely outrightly criminalize people. And that is a great danger, which means in the end, our civil liberties are being eroded. And what Bush said was that the terrorists hate us for our freedoms. I think we've done more damage to our freedoms than any terrorist could ever do.
I mean, Chris, this is the trouble, isn't it? It's now, we're in what, the 13th year of the war on terror or something, and there's something of a sort of self-sustaining cycle about the policy initiatives, the reaction to them, the policy, and so on, isn't there?
Definitely. Well, partly when there's a foreign policy failure or a series of foreign policy failures, they ratchet up the Islamophobia to try and sort of cover that up in a way, and to lay the ground for or desperately try and create the conditions in which they can continue the project. And I think everything people say about the irrationality of these initiatives is absolutely clear, and no doubt they are partly driven by this kind of terrible alliance that we have with the Saudis. I think that's going on as well. But I mean, the point is, it may be irrational, but the problem is it's a drip, drip, drip effect that can actually have a poisoning impact on British society. And I think we've got to be very concerned about this. You do see the rise of UKIP, which may be one of the drivers of this, but it's also a warning that the body politic in Britain can be infected by racism. It can happen. We shouldn't be complacent about that. So I think it's very important that we call the politicians out on this stuff, and we don't. We're not in any way silenced by it. We have to call these kind of statements not just irrational; they're racist. That's what's happening. There's a systematic demonisation of the Muslim community going on that I think it's all of our responsibility to speak out against. Because if we don't, then the community can become isolated and can be in big trouble.
Chris?
I just wanted one small thing to add, I suppose, to uplift. I think that a lot of these things have been criticised. The mums thing was broadly criticised, I think, in the media, and so they haven't sort of managed to sell these ideas and all the time. And the Syria policy is widely seen as having failed. So against that, I think we are seeing at least the media establishment and other politicians saying this is not working.
Dr. Mimi, on the investigation of the Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, most people seem to assume, as Chris has said, that this won't result in a ban. Perhaps we shouldn't be complacent until we've seen the results. But do you think that perhaps what will happen is that there are people in this country from the Brotherhood who could be deported? We know that one of the ways in which the government likes to play these things is to get a high-profile deportation. It looks as if they're dealing with the problem. But do you think this might happen? And indeed, the people who were sent back are facing death sentences?
Are they going to deport thousands of people?
Yeah.
There are thousands of members of the Brotherhood in this country. They don't present themselves as members of the Brotherhood, but many of the Islamic institutions in this country are run by people who are affiliates of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is the largest organized movement in the world today. Islamic movement, that is, the largest Islamic movement in the world. And we've had excellent ties with the community, sometimes even with the establishment. And I agree with Chris that the inquiry comes simply because of pressure on Cameron. Blair. So much pressure on Cameron, not only from the Saudis and the Emiratis directly and the coup leaders in Egypt, but also from a lobby within this country. And that's what's dangerous. That's what he couldn't withstand, because there was so much pressure from within the business community in this country that the Saudis and the Emiratis were threatening to cancel deals. And in November, the Emiratis did cancel a deal because Cameron refused to close down Al Hiwar TV channel, of which I happen to be the chairman. They asked him to close down the channel because they thought things could be done the Bedouin way in their own communities. Cameron said to them, we cannot. A prime minister here cannot close even a newspaper. If you have something against them, you go to the law or to Ofcom, whatever. And that's why I'm personally satisfied that eventually this inquiry will come to nothing. But apart from Cameron telling those who tried to pressure him so much, I've done my bit, and I've appointed people who are sympathetic to you, the ambassador in Saudi Arabia, etc. And these are the results. So off my back.
Johan, do you think that there is coordination between these different things, or do you think it's simply that the political environment has become toxic enough for these initiatives to kind of spring up like morning mushrooms?
Yeah, no, I actually, to be honest with you, I think that there's an environment of just, hysteria and suspicion around Muslims, and I don't think it's really coordinated. It's just sprung out of that environment, and everyone seems to be out on, a mission to resolve the world's problems, domestic problems, and unfortunately, Muslims are, they're an ideal group to use to hammer in an agenda at the same time. So, yeah, multiple reasons, but it's not coordinated or structured. I don't find it to be.
I mean, Chris, you were saying, there's been a reaction to these things, but it's a very peculiar political situation here because you have very large elements of the establishment, cross-party establishment agreement on these basic issues, but the society is quite resistant to them, almost without sort of very much mainstream political leadership.
I think it's very confused. And at one hand, the political parties, want to be seen to be tough on immigration and Muslim issues. On the other hand, they will be going out there very shortly and trying to appeal to them for their votes. And they're finding a little bit of a trouble because UKIP is now seen as this, big threat to all three of the main political parties. They're taking votes from them, so they have to counter that. But at the same time, particularly for the Labour Party, it's got to somehow make sure that it secures principally the British Asian vote, the Muslim vote in this country. And so there's going to be problems in that. Of course, it points to the fact that they don't have one consistent approach, that handles both, and that they're not prepared to take, UKIP on, really, instead of actually pointing to UKIP and say these policies are an outrage, etc., and you shouldn't be doing it, and we're not going to be led in your direction. That's exactly what they're doing. They're attempting to sort of take over some of UKIP's policies, and therefore, of course, British Muslims and other communities are stigmatised as a result. Then, of course, you have other things that crop up, and Michael Gove, as the Secretary of State for Education, his track record as neocon.
I'm going to have to stop you just there before we get on to the question of Michael Gove, which obviously could be the subject of many future editions of analysis, and no doubt will be. I hope you'll be rejoining us for those discussions and others in future contributions to this programme.